Solving equations by factoring, part 1. We're going to start with a few examples on how to solve equations by factoring. We're going to start with simple trinomials, and we're going to factor them together. The first example I have is x squared plus 13x minus 30 is equal to 3. Now, in order to solve this trinomial and to factor it, my first recommendation is we look at the first coefficient, the leading coefficient of the x squared, and we want to see if there's a number here other than 1. Since there is no number here where it's basically a 1, there's not really anything that we can factor out of these three terms that will allow us to, make it easier to factor. So we're going to go ahead and just check on that. If this is a 1, we don't need to factor out any numbers from the next two terms. And then we'll go ahead, since this is a relatively simple factoring question, and we're going to make two parentheses to prepare how we do this. So using different colors, the first one we look at is our first term. Now we have to think to ourselves, what times what will give me x squared? And that's a very simple answer. It would just be simply x times x. And we put that in the first position and the first position of the parentheses. Because when you multiply x times x, you get x squared, right? So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the last term in our polynomial, in our trinomial, negative 30. And we have to think not just what two numbers are going to equal negative 30, but when you add them up, they should also give us the middle term, or the total of the middle term of that coefficient, which is 13. So it's kind of, it has to agree with both parts. It has to, when you multiply a number times a number, has to give you negative 30. And when you add those same two numbers, it has to give you positive 13, which ends up being the middle term here in this trinomial. So you have to think about, when you add it up, what's going to give you 13. Now, negative 30, the first thing that comes to mind is, 10 times 3, right? And when we put 10 times 3, if we add them up, just as 10 times 3, we get 13. But when we multiply 10 times 3, we don't get negative 30. We get positive 30, and we need to get negative 30. So we're going to have to try something else, right? And you have to keep in mind that this is a positive 13, and that's a negative. When you multiply two numbers, and the answer is a negative number, one has to be positive and one has to be negative. So we're going to have to think of something. Now, if we were to put negative 15 times 2, right, we would get negative 30. And if we were to add those two, we wouldn't get positive 13, we'd get negative 13. But that's easily remedied if we change that negative 15 to positive and that 2 to negative. Now, when we add 15 and negative 2, we get 13, which meets both requirements. And those are the answers right there. It would be positive 15 minus 2. And that is this trinomial factor. Now, how do we solve for this? Well, we would take the first one. See, both of these, when you multiply them, give you 0. So, as you know, with multiplication, any number multiplied by 0 will give you 0. So if this number here, if this parentheses were to equal 0, then that would, when you multiply it by this, would give you 0. Or if this parentheses, if we were to put 2 here, 2 take away 2, would give me 0, and 2 plus 15 would give me 17. 17 plus times 0 would give me 0. So if I were to make whatever is in here, if I were to place a number here or here, and it would equal 0, it would make the entire thing 0. So in order to find the solution, or also called finding the zeros, we can go 15, x plus 15 equals 0. And we can use subtraction property of equality, subtract both sides by 15, and we get x equals negative 15. Now, on the other end, x minus 2 equals 0. We add both sides, addition property of equality with 2, x is equal to 2. So therefore, we have two zeros. We have negative 15 and negative 2. And that's the answer our solving equations first example. Another example we can look at is x squared minus 8x equals 12. Sorry, negative 12. All right, so this is a little different. Here we had them all on one side, which is where you need them to be in order to factor. So we're just going to have to make a little change, and we're going to have to get this over here. And the best way to do that is we're going to use addition property of equality. Some students like to think of it as if I change over the equal sign, it changes the sign from negative to positive. What's actually happening is you're adding 12 to both sides. What you do to one side of the equation, you do to the other to balance it out. And we get 0. X squared minus 8x plus 12. Now we're ready to factor. So we make our parentheses. 1, 2, 1, 2 equals 0. So first we look at this x squared. Is there a leading coefficient, a coefficient in front of this x squared, which is our first term, that we can factor out, right? No, there's just a 1. You're not going to make any progress. You'll just be spinning your wheels if you factor that out. So we're going to go ahead and write what times what is x squared, and we write it here in the front of both parentheses. X times x is going to give you x squared. So this beginning term is what you write in the front of those two parentheses. Now the next thing we have is 12. We have to think of what two numbers that I multiply give me positive 12, and when I add them, give me negative 8. Now, this is a positive number, and that's a negative number. If when we add them, we get negative 8, right? At least one of them has to be a negative number. But when we multiply, it's going to be positive. So that means if I'm working with a negative number, both have to be negative, because if one's negative and one's positive, guess what? Your answer is going to be negative. So what we're going to have to do is figure out what two negatives give me 12 that when I add them up, give me negative 8. And now let me take my trusty pencil. Let's see. Well, I know negative 2 and negative 6, they give me positive 12. When I add them up, do I get negative 8? Yep, I sure do. And there's my answer. Now you could try out. If you try negative 3 and negative 4, you get 12 positive as the answer. But when you add them up, you get 7. We're looking for negative 8. And this one works. So x minus 2, x minus 6. Now we're going to find the solution. We take the first one. I'll do it in red. X minus 2. If this becomes 0, so whatever number, when I solve in here, plus 2, addition property of equality, both sides, x equals 2. If I were to make x equal to 2, 2 take away 2 would become 0, and 2 take away 6 would be negative 4, right? And if that were the case, 0 times negative 4 gives me 0. That's why this is a 0. For x minus 6 equal to 0, we would add 6 and add 6. Addition property of equality, what you do to one side, you have to do to the other. X equals 6. So if I were to say 6 take away 2, I would get 4. And 6 take away 6, I would get 0. 4 times 0 would give me 0. So both of these are zeros. Both of these are solutions to this factoring form.